Well, hello there. How's everyone doing today? Today I'm going to take a tour of my shop. Now, in previous videos I've talked about some of the tools that I used to make these campers and other woodworking projects, but today I'm going to spend a little bit of time, take a tour of the shop, talk about a couple philosophies. Before I get started, I want to keep a couple things in mind. The tour of my shop and the tools that I use and my philosophies are my philosophies. I'm not necessarily saying that they're absolutely the best way or always the right way, but they're just what I do and what works for me. A couple other considerations comes down to money, and I'm going to talk about that a lot. Tools are expensive, and also space. So my workshop is just a simple 2-car garage, which works well in some things, but when you're making campers, sometimes space comes into play. So a lot of times that's going to dictate your strategies or where you go. So we'll start off with my first and perhaps my oldest tool, my table saw. Well, we'll make the table saw the center of attention for this part. This table saw I've had for nearly 20 years. I bought it back in 2003 and it's been with me for numerous woodworking projects. It's just a good old-fashioned Ryobi table saw. I believe when I purchased it, I probably paid about $300 to $400 for it. And amazingly, though Ryobi is a lot of times considered basically just kind of like a hobbyist tool set, this table saw has been very reliable. There's been many occasions where I've considered upgrading it or getting something newer, and I've always came back to this table saw and decided never to. In fact, recently I bought a pre-owned Powermatic table saw, which is a great big cabinet shop style table saw. It does need some TLC, of course, but in the end I was going to fix that table saw up and replace this one, but in the end I actually came back to the Ryobi and decided just to stick with it. So it's not even just a matter of money, it's a matter of this table saw works very well. And I'll say for me, and kind of going back to my earlier point about the size of the shop, a table saw like this works much better than a great big cabinet style table saw. Now, one thing to consider is a cabinet style table saw, a lot of times people will use those to cut sheet goods. And I think that works very well on one condition, and that is that you have a big work area. I've always largely been just a hobbyist and worked out of typically 1- and 2-car garages just like you guys see here. Starting back years ago, I've broken down probably hundreds of sheets of plywood, both for campers and other various projects I've done over the last 20 years. And I'll talk about the tool I use in greater detail later, but ultimately I got in the habit of just using some good old saw horses and a circular saw with a high tooth count to make fine cuts to break down most of my sheet goods. So that allowed me to get by with a smaller table saw like this Ryobi. Let me show you some of the features I like about this Ryobi outside of its general reliability, which has provided me for the last 20 years. First and foremost, other than the typical table saw as you see here with the traditional fence, what I've really liked about it was it had this mount right here for a router. So a router bolts in from the bottom, as you guys can see here, and it plugs right in the table saw, and all you got to do is just switch the cords out and you have this built-in router table. So it's kind of like 2 big shop tools in one, and that's been so useful, and for me so much more convenient than having a separate router table, especially in a situation where I wouldn't have room to store it. Now, what I found that I almost exclusively use this table saw for, other than the router table function, is ripping boards. And this thing does well. As always though, I always put a high quality blade on here, make sure it's sharp, and make sure it's clean. We'll move on to my next used floor model tool, the compound miter saw. So this tool right here, my compound miter saw, is what I use when I'm primarily making cross cuts. So I'll rip boards on the table saw and I'll do all of my cross cuts on here. Years ago I bought a dedicated stand for it, which has some extension arms, and I basically just keep it set up on this as a station in my garage, permanently, but it still allows me the flexibility to move it around if I need to. This is a DeWalt. DeWalt uses some weird model indicators for these various saws, but this has the 12-inch blade, and it's a compound, sliding compound miter saw. There's a couple variations, but you guys will typically see this particular model for sale at Lowe's. They run about between $300 and $400, depending on if you get them on a sale. And this thing, I've used it for years. I haven't had it quite as long as I've had my table saw, but it's always worked well, and it's done for me. I put a high tooth count blade on it, and I keep it clean and make sure it's sharpened, and this thing works out well. All right, guys, so what you can see is this is my general workspace right here. I've got a narrow workbench right back here, and what I found is I made this larger workspace right here that actually is the height of the table saw. I made this probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and it works great as an outfeed table. And then I found that having a major work table like this that I can work from all sides around is more useful than having a great big workbench that's butted up against the wall. So that workbench up there, butted up against the wall, is only about 20 inches deep, and as you guys can see, it's pretty much covered with various things. Let me talk about, so other than building these campers and general woodworking, you know, I do a lot of other projects. I mean, you guys have seen I do leatherworking. I'll pretty much do all of the basic automotive maintenance and repairs on my own cars, and, you know, general household use. I keep, though this probably looks like a mess to a lot of you, the tools that you see on here are ones that I've found through the years that I always come back to and need. So I keep them very handy, and I'm always reaching for them. I'm not going to go through every tool that I have up here, but I'm going to highlight a couple of the hand tools that I always come back to when I'm working on these campers. All right, guys, here's a little better shot. So believe it or not, some of the most common hand tools I always reach for is I've got a little brush right here for brushing off dust off things. I have a mallet. I've went through a couple of these, but I use a mallet all the time, and a small little finishing nail hammer. Now these three tools I found I'm always reaching for one thing or another. I have a magnetic bar on my workbench, and I have a couple tools that I always come handy for. When it's come to working on the campers, I have two style of wire cutters. I'm always reaching for these. I also have a pair of dedicated needle nose pliers, which I'm always coming to. Now I also keep a nice high quality USA made Crescent Wrench on there. I may not necessarily use this a lot for the camper builds, but I find it very handy, and these tools I find myself always reaching for, and it's so handy to have them right here just on this little magnetic bar. Over here, also hooked up on my pegboard, is I keep an assortment of screwdrivers. In this case, this is also a German brand. It's called, what's it called here? I don't even know. W-I-H-A, Wia, I have no idea how you pronounce it. But these are a high quality set of screwdrivers. But believe it or not, the whole set I found on an Amazon warehouse deal for like 35 bucks. But screwdrivers are one of those things, especially the go-to ones, your Phillips and your flathead, where I think it pays to spend a little bit of extra money for a higher quality one. And last but not least, as far as the common tools up here, is I always keep a very thin Kerf handsaw. Now I don't use this for cutting most of my cuts, but it sure does come in handy every once in a while. All right, let's get into this set of garage tool drawers, tool chest, I guess you would say. Again, this was a sale that kind of a flash sale I found at Lowe's, and I got this whole setup here for about $300 to $400. I don't remember the exact price, but it's been very useful. I'm not going to go through every drawer, but you guys can imagine it's very convenient to have a dedicated and nice storage mechanism for all the various tools that you use. Okay, guys, I'm going to get into some of the hand tools here. As many of you guys know, I'm a big fan of DeWalt, and particularly Milwaukee, and I typically use the cordless ones, or the ones that have a battery. I'll show you some of the common tools that I use and how they, in some cases, supplement larger standalone tools. But one thing I want to say here is the cordless tools are typically more expensive than their corded counterparts, plus the fact that you have to buy batteries and you're constantly charging them. for the way I do work, the cordless ones with the battery are worth the extra cost and the hassle. However, I understand the barrier of entry in terms of cost, or maybe just what you already have on hand, may preclude the use of that. So I think a corded tool, as long as they're the categories of tools which I'll identify, are just as useful, and that's a personal preference and perhaps a matter of cost and what you have on hand. But before we go any further, let me touch base on safety. Now, I know to many of us, if you read an introductory woodworking or automotive book or any kind of how-to book, safety is the very first thing you talk about. Perhaps many of you, just like I did, as I would typically flip through that page and move on, and I never gave a lot of thought to safety. But I'm going to tell you a little story that happened to me that really put my mind or my headspace back into the importance of safety. Particularly something like this, a full face shield. So I was working on Camper 3.0, and I was working on the tub section. I was using a router that had a cutoff bit on it to trim up some side on one side, very much like the tub here. Normally, I would just take out the router, turn it on, zip off and cut off whatever I needed to, and move on from there. But today, or on this particular day that I'm telling the story about, something in me told me to put on my full face shield, and I did. I began cutting off some piece on the side, and all of a sudden, without any notice, I heard a loud screech and then a hard slap in my full face clear shield, and the shield actually flew off my head in the garage and landed on the floor behind me. Well, later what I found happened was the bearing on the cut-off router bit actually seized up, and when it did, it broke from the bit itself and flew back at me and hit my shield. The shield had a very noticeable ding in it, and the scary thing about it was the ding was roughly in the area where my left eye would have been. I firmly believe to this day that that shield probably saved my eye. And from now on, I don't take safety lightly. Let's talk about some of the safety items that I commonly use. Well, as I said, I always use one of these full face shields. I buy these on Amazon. I replace them frequently because the plastic on them gets dinged up or dirty or so forth. And if I recall, they typically run about 15 or 20 bucks. Probably the best 20 bucks that you'll spend. Another thing is hearing protection. Listen, I'm getting older, and I actually have hearing aids that I'm supposed to wear, and my hearing is very bad. Now, I don't know what the cause of it is. I've obviously been exposed to a lot of loud noises in my normal job throughout my, the years that I worked, but also undoubtedly running saws and hammering and all of those other things could also impact my hearing. So I wear hearing protection. Now these happen to be a Bluetooth set. These darn things are getting so inexpensive on Amazon. I think these were about 50 bucks. And the nice thing is these will allow you to connect through via Bluetooth on your phone, so you can listen to music or a podcast or whatever you'd like to do. I always wear some kind of dust protection if I'm doing a lot of sanding or a lot of cutting. Now this one is just kind of like an N95 style mask. It has a nice seal on it, no filter, and then just straps that you put around your head. A little better than your typical medical COVID mask that we've all seen around, but not much beyond that. Now, if I'm going to be using some heavy chemicals, some resins for fiberglass, if I'm spraying any kind of finish, when I'm using the roll-on bed liner type finish, I go on to an actual filtered breathing protection. And again, back in my early days of woodworking, I never used that, but now I think it's very important. And then finally, the next thing is a push stick. I use this. It has a little magnetic thing here. This always stays on my table saw, and I use this all the time for pushing through wood. I wouldn't use anything else other than this, especially not your hands. All right, guys, so when I was talking about the table saw, one thing I talked about is that when I break down large sheet goods or pieces of plywood, I typically use a circular saw. This right here is a Milwaukee 18-volt cordless circular saw, and I put on it a high tooth count blade for finer finishes. This works out really well for me, and whenever I need to break down a piece of plywood, this is what always my go-to saw. Sometimes I've gotten pretty good over the years of making pretty smooth and straight cuts just with a circular saw on plywood, and typically I don't need to clean it up. But if I do, once I break down the big sheets of plywood into some more smaller manageable pieces, I can still run it through the table saw if I need to. So this, especially if you're going to go with a smaller table saw, in my view, is a must-have. Now, many people would say there's no room in finer carpentry for a circular saw, and I disagree. With practice and a good blade, these things can get you really far, particularly when you're working with large sheet goods. Another go-to saw I use is just a regular jigsaw. Now, I don't use this every day, but this definitely comes in handy in a lot of parts of the project. Now, again, this is a DeWalt 20-volt brushless jigsaw. I forgot what they call it, but it's the handle style. I also have a Milwaukee jigsaw that is, I apologize guys, I don't remember what they're called, but it's the different style where you hold the main body of the jigsaw. And I feel like this is an indispensable tool, and I use it all the time. I think both the Milwaukee and the DeWalt serve me pretty well. Next, I want to talk about a planer. Now, I think for a lot of wood, depending on the project you're doing in a wood shop, I think a lot of times hobbyists such as myself can get away without using a planer. However, when I was building the campers, and particularly working with the cedar ones, the planer was an absolutely must, because it allowed me to thin out and straighten out a lot of those cedar boards. Now, I've broken a lot of tools, particularly the time that I've been working on these camper projects. I bought, this one is a 13-inch, or 12-inch, I'm sorry, this is a 12-inch planer. And before this one, I had bought a Wen one, a WEN. It's like a Chinese branded planer. On my very first camper, that is the one I used. Now, of course, why did I buy that one? Well, it was cost, right? We all want to get the cheaper thing. Well, that planer only made it through one camper before it broke, and I went ahead and bought this DeWalt one. Now, these run about $400 to $500 again, depending on where you buy it, if you get sales, etc. If you're going to be building these campers, particularly building a cedar-sided one, I can't really imagine a way that you could do it without this. Now, if you're just a general woodworking hobbyist, it's really nice having these, but you could probably get away with it, or it could be one of the second or third standalone tool that you get. Sanding. I do a lot of sanding, and I've broken a number of these random orbital sanders in my tenure, particularly working on these campers. But I find these to be indispensable. Now, many of you guys know there's many sanders. There's your standard square reciprocating sanders. There is belt sanders. There's fixed standalone sanders. And they all have their role and purpose. I have a belt sander that I commonly use for things. But when it comes to the most common and most versatile sander I use, it's a random orbital sander. Now, I have both Milwaukee and a DeWalt one, as you see right here, and they both serve me very well. I've actually broke both of them by various drops throughout the time, which is going to happen anytime you're busy in a workshop. But I think they're both very good random orbital sanders. I particularly fancy my DeWalt one. Now, one of my favorite tools in the shop, and I've talked about this in ad nauseum, is my cordless brad nailer. This one right here is a Milwaukee 18 gauge one, and this is by far the one that I reach for and use the most. As you guys can see, this thing has been had a lot of use. It's dropped a number of times. That's going to happen whenever you're in the shop working, and this thing always comes back for more and has been very reliable. My favorite brad nailer. You can use an aired one, which is fine, but if you can swing it and afford a cordless one or a battery operated one, I highly recommend it. It's not necessary, but it does certainly come in handy, is a 23 gauge brad nailer. This particular one is also a Milwaukee. I bought this not too long ago. I certainly don't use it as much as the 18 gauge, but if you can swing it as far as cost, I definitely recommend one of these. Illumination. Again, a guy like me, a hobbyist working in his garage, of course I try to have the garage lit up as well as I can, but there's no way of getting around the fact that it's nice to have auxiliary lights. Now, there's a lot of these lights on the market. They are set up just to use the standard batteries for either Milwaukee, DeWalt, or whatever your battery ecosystem platform is. These lights are just cheap Chinese made ones. I think I paid about 30 bucks for it, but they're LED, and with today's technology, they're super bright and turn out really well. As a side note, you guys probably, this particular light is meant to fit Milwaukee batteries, but as you guys can see, I have a DeWalt battery pack on it. And what I did is there's these mounting conversion plates that you can buy on Amazon. I can't say they exist for every single battery to battery comparison here, but I bought a couple of these and I use them so that I can use Milwaukee batteries on DeWalt devices and vice versa. So in this case, I'm using a DeWalt battery on a little light made for a Milwaukee battery. They work well, and I've also used them on other things like drills and so forth. And if you have multiple ecosystems, it just allows you a little bit more versatility. And this is just a traditional, you know, pistol grip style light that has some adjustability here. I recommend having some good illumination in the garage. All right, last but not least is having a good drill with a standard chuck on it and a driver. Now this particular driver is a DeWalt. I always keep a Phillips head bit on here, and I actually have this hanging on my pegboard for quick access. This is just a standard Milwaukee screwdriver. It's a pretty heavy duty one. It's got the hammer drive on it. I'm sorry, I called it a screwdriver. You guys know what I mean, a cordless drill. Definitely recommend one. Now, if money was a factor, you could get away with just a drill and chuck in, you know, Phillips head drivers and so forth if you were driving in screws. If you can swing it, get a separate one though. It makes it a lot easier. In fact, I have multiple impact drivers and drills that I use in the shop, and I'll keep chucked with dedicated drivers for different kinds of screw heads or different things I'm doing. As you guys can see here, this is actually a buffing wheel that I was using to buff out some scratches that were on 5.0. So guys, this is going to cover not by any stretch all of the main tools I use, but it's going to cover a lot of the big ones and some of the philosophies of use. Let me touch on another idea, philosophy and use, in terms of how I stage different tools in my garage. I'm going to use the example here of my tape measures. Now, bear with me, but I think this will save you a lot of time. All right, guys. So, as you can see on my compound miter saw station, I have a tape measure on there. This tape measure never leaves this area. It's always right here by my compound miter saw. And I do that for a very specific reason. So many times when I would just use one tape measure, I would measure something out in the garage, in some other part of the garage. Inevitably, I would sit down that tape measure, I would come over to cut something, and then I'd realize I don't have my tape measure and I have to go back over and get it. So tape measures are relatively inexpensive. Buy multiples and place them by the various workstations in your garage and never move them. Over here on my main bench area, I always keep another tape measure, and this one I typically stow it right here on this little little shelf part that comes out the side of the workbench, and this one will be the one that I move around the garage and use if I'm measuring other things. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate everybody's support. Let me know in the comments if what are some of the things that you guys out there building your own campers and other woodworking projects might do with your tools to help with organize. and like and subscribe. And as just a reminder, I started a new channel called Vegas Underground. It's linked up in my About section. Has nothing to do with woodworking, and I am kind of working through some different material on there, but it would be a big help to me if you guys could subscribe, if anything, just to get my subscriber count up until I get the channel firmed up and moving along. So thanks again, guys, for watching. I hope this is useful.